Flow is technically defined as an optimal state of consciousness, a state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. If you're interested in peak performance, understand what's going on in your brain and your body when you're actually performing at your best. It starts to melt away and disappear. Sense of self-consciousness, the ugly, right? It shuts up finally. Time passes strangely. Most commonly, just get so sucked into what you in the body when people are performing at their very best. And flow is a big part of that equation. So reason there's so many sort of neuroscientists on my board and that sort of stuff. And the reason we do all this work. So flow makes us 500% more productive. It doubles learning rate. You can't do peak performance without flow. You got to stop and ask yourself, what kind of impossible challenges aren't you going after? What would you go after if you could be 500% more productive, if you could cut learning times in half, or 600% more creative and innovative?
What does it take to do the impossible? What does it take to level up your game like never before? What does it take for individuals, organizations, for even institutions to achieve paradigm shifting? Nothing is ever the same again. Breakthroughs.
Our mission is to decode the neurobiology of flow and cognitive peak performance. Access the minds of maverick scientists, groundbreaking innovators, and world-leading experts to understand what it takes to achieve ultimate human performance, so you can feel your best, perform your best, and accomplish your boldest goals. I'm your host, Rian Doris, and together with best-selling author Stephen Kotler, I present to you Flow Research Collective Radio.
One of the things I think is worth noting is in your group of advisors, you have 14 advisors on your website. 11 of the 14 are doctors. And a lot of what you focus on is not just these concepts and the research that you've done to prove them, put them into action, hone them, whatever, is they are backed by this idea of science, medicine.
Okay. So at the heart of most of my career, first as a journalist, then as an author writing books about these topics, then as a neuroscientist leading international team of researchers into these topics, the progression has been focused on peak human performance. And by peak human performance, I only mean getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. That's all the definition of peak performance is. It's getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. And at the heart of that biology, at the heart of my work, is a state of consciousness known to researchers as flow. You may call it runner's high or being in the zone, or you play basketball as being unconscious. If you're a jazz musician, you're in the pocket. The lingo is endless. Flow is technically defined as an optimal state of consciousness, a state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. More specifically, it refers to any of those moments that we're all familiar with, rapt attention, total absorption, just get so focused on the task at hand, so focused on what you're doing that everything else just starts to melt away and disappear. Sense of self-consciousness, the inner critic voice in your head that's always on, is always telling you you're too fat, too dumb, too ugly, right? It shuts up finally, thank God. Time passes strangely. Most commonly, just get so sucked into what you're doing that 5 hours go by in like 5 minutes. Occasionally, sometimes in flow, it'll slow down. You're going to freeze from effect. And throughout all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. So at the Flow Research Collective, what we do is we study, and I'll talk about why, and this is the answer to like the science question, the neurobiology of peak human performance. So what's going on in the brain and the body when people are performing at their very best? And flow is a big part of that equation. So the reason there's so many sort of neuroscientists on my board and that sort of stuff, and the reason we do all this work is the psychology of flow, which was very well established over the course of the 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, they were starting to train people using the psychology. And the problem with training from psychology is very, very individual, right? It's shaped by nurture, it's shaped by nature, and really fundamental things to peak performance, like where are you on the introversion extroversion scale? Meaning, like, if you're super introverted, I can't teach you anything if there are other people around because you're handicapped, right? Those kinds of things. What are your risk tolerances like? And what are they like in different situations, right? People have one level of physical risk tolerance, another level of emotional risk tolerance, or sexual or intellectual, or take your pick, right? Those are very individual. Psychology is very individual, but if you go one level down, you go to the neurobiology, Neurobiology is shaped by evolution and it's constant in all humans. So if you're looking to make things reliable and repeatable, neurobiology is your tool. I got very lucky in my career. I started as a journalist and I was interested in peak performance, and I was also interested in neuroscience. It was a language I sort of spoke, and I had problems with the psychology. I always felt like when I was trying to just improve myself as a writer, as an athlete, as a whatever, I was getting so confused, and there'd be these nitpicking arguments over crazy little details. And I was like, none of this is practical. I don't know what to do with this. And when I got into the neurobiology and figured out you could train from it, it really worked. And we, at the Flow Research Collective, teamed up with folks at Stanford and USC and UCLA and et cetera, et cetera. And we studied the neurobiology of this stuff. And then we used it to train people in 130 countries. We train tens of thousands of people every month. And this is everything from like just individuals, right? Soccer moms and soccer dads and insurance brokers and, podcasters, and take your pick, all the way to professional athletes, members of special forces, and then companies, or with like Facebook or Accenture or Audience, blah, blah, blah. The point I'm trying to make is wildly diverse group of people. It's an intense training. You go through with it like a PhD psychologist as a coach. We see a 70-80% increase in flow on the back end. And the reason I'm telling you all this stuff is the reason you see so many doctors, the reason the neurobiology matters so much is we want this reliable and repeatable for anyone, anywhere. That's the benefit of all the science. And we're also really big fans at the collective of what I like to call cognitive literacy. If you're interested in peak performance, understand what's going on in your brain and your body when you're actually performing at your best. I'm just arming you with information, right? Like, it's really important to us. And you can it's also fun to teach people neuroscience, because most people think neuroscience is an incredibly difficult thing that they're never going to be able to learn, and it's scary and all that stuff. And so it's very empowering to people, not only like when you start, hey, this is how your brain works, and people start getting it. Using neuroscience, this thing that they didn't think they could learn, to actually massively improve their performance on a day-to-day basis. That's a very sort of empowering to watch people go, oh my God, I can learn something like this, and I can use it, and I can, impact my day-to-day life. It's cool. When I came into flow science, my goal was to put it on a hard science footing. This is what I wanted to do with my life. Because I came in as a journalist, I didn't specialize. When I first started looking at the puzzle and people were having trouble solving it, I was like, that's because the answers are in all these different disciplines. And scientists don't talk to one another. They're like everybody else. They're balkanized in their disciplines. And people don't actually realize how, like, even neuroscience, how balkanized it is into like tiny micro disciplines. And they don't talk to each other. They talk to journalists who talk to everybody. Or, now in our approach, we take a very multidisciplinary approach to neuroscience for this very reason, because I want people from all these different disciplines. So people who don't think like me, people who have wildly outside perspectives, who can, come hammer on my ideas and our research and all that stuff. So long answer.
You commented on something in there I think is super true. You mentioned the idea of this biology, neuroscience. Some people just have fears around it. I think a lot of it's intimidation. It just seems so foreign. It's almost like it's its own language. So specifically, when you talk about, hey, getting our biology to work for us, not against us, can you put some legs under that table for me?
Let me give you a bunch of really simple examples. So flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. You want more flow in your life? Triggers are your toolkit. There are 26 known triggers. There are probably way more. That's just what we've discovered so far. They all have one thing in common. Flow can only show up when all of our attention is in the right here, the right now, on the task at hand. That's what all the triggers do. They work a bunch of different ways neurobiologically, but they drive our attention into the now, into the task at hand. So this tells you that one of the first triggers, the most obvious trigger, is complete concentration. So when we train this, some of how we teach people about complete concentration is manicuring the environment. Part of our biology is that we have a salience detection system. When novelty shows up in the world, we notice it, right? This kept us alive. The problem is we have cell phones that are literally designed to abuse this, right? They've been designed to resemble slot machines in how they try to get your attention. They use novelty to try to get your attention. We are not more powerful than, this is hardwired biology. We're not going to win that fight. So we teach people to practice distraction management. Turn everything off ahead of time, right? Manicure the space, because your biology is going to win. You're not going to win this war. You literally are not going to win this war. How long should you completely concentrate on the task at hand is another question, right? And there's an actual precise answer to this. You got to start by starting, right? If you can get 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, it's fine. And let me emphasize something here. When we talk about flow as peak performance, one of the things that goes through the roof is productivity. And we know this. So McKinsey, giant business consultancy, went around the globe. They spent 10 years trying to figure out how much more productive executives are in flow than out of flow. On average, it was 500% more productive. So this means you can go to work on Monday, spend Monday in a flow state, take Tuesday through Friday off, and you get as much done as your steady state peers. 2 days a week in flow, full days, which is difficult, but you're 1,000% more productive than the competition. Huge boosts in productivity. Okay. So you will get time back for your life by manicuring a space for complete concentration. I'm asking you for time. We're all busy, right? Everybody is busy. You're going to end up being so productive in this time that you'll end up with getting time back. But research shows that you want 90 minutes to 110 minutes for complete concentration. Why 90 to 110 minutes? Well, it turns out, as I said, you want to start by starting. If you get 10, if you can get 20, but the brain has a built-in focusing slot that's 90 to 110 minutes long. Well, that's weird. No, it's not. Why? Because we know we go through sleep cycles. Sleeping cycles, they're 90 to 110 minutes long. That's a REM cycle. That's a full sleep cycle. Just like we have a sleep cycle, we have a focus, wake, alert cycle. It's the same length. So it turns out that as you train yourself to kind of focus and be alert, it's very easy to build up to this 90 and 20 minutes. You have to get longer. There's all kinds of stuff you have to kind of sort of do to extend beyond that. But to learn how to focus that long, it's sort of built in. So these are just simple flow examples of getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. Another one is you want to start your work session, your complete concentration session, in accordance with your circadian rhythms. This is a no-duh for most people, but like I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. That's when my brain does its best work. I am married to a night owl. We're all a little bit different. And if you can, if your job permits it, you want to start your work session in accordance with your circadian rhythms, practicing distraction management on the front end and with this 99-minute slot.
Fantastic examples and super relevant, which brings me to another thought. And I think based on your tenure in this industry, it seems like, but please correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like in the beginning, there was so much of this studied around, especially athletes, really getting them to get to the next level. And then I would say over the last 30 years, maybe?
It was athletes and it was artists. And in the fault lies with both myself and me at Csikszentmihalyi. We're probably the two great popularizers of flow ideas. And Mike, Csikszentmihalyi, started out, he was studying rock climbers in his initial study group, and dancers and artists. And so that got into the literature. And then I made it worse because I wrote a ton about athletes and flow. And when we heard about it the most, it was also like Jimmy Johnson in the 90s co-opted Csikszentmihalyi's idea to bring the Dallas Cowboys a couple of Super Bowl victories and got a lot of attention. A couple other things happened in sports. So like it got the attention. But you're absolutely right. In fact, if you go back to the early research on flow, who gets the most flow? In the early research, there were two things that showed up. One, the most common flow state on earth is reading, period. So reading is the most common flow state on earth. And let me take it a second one, because this is even crazier.
Is it going to the bathroom?
No, but a good flow example. Well, people say, like, I meet people on, I'm at airports. They're like, oh yeah, I'm the executive director of the Flow Research Collective. We're obviously an organization of plumbers. So, okay, bad joke aside, the second most common flow state on earth, and this is early research, I don't know if it's still true. So there's two versions of flow. There's individual flow, me in a flow state, you in a flow state, or there's group flow. It's a shared collective version of a flow state. It could be interpersonal flow, two people lost in a great conversation, group flow, team flow, fourth quarter comeback in basketball or football, or a great rock concert, the band just totally comes together, or communitas. This is flow at scale. It's huge. When you go to a rock concert and everybody merges with the music and you're all clapping and sync and all, that's communitas, right? It's flow at scale. So the most common, besides reading, is interpersonal flow. Two middle managers in an office environment having a conversation at work. They get so sucked into the conversation that a couple hours go by. So neither of those examples, as you can imagine, involve artists or athletes. And it was so hard until we got a language around it, until we got all the neurobiology, until all this stuff came up. Was flow a mystical experience? That was the first question I looked at in my very first book on flow. I was talking to surfers and they kept saying, yeah, every time I'm in a tube, I become one with the ocean. I just one with the ocean, which that just sounds like a wild ass mystical experience. And today we can talk about these things out loud. Go back to the 80s and 90s and try talking about among serious people, right? You're just going to get laughed out of the room. But Dr. Andrew Newberg, my first mentor, had just done the very first brain imaging to image Tibetan Buddhists and Franciscan nuns during ecstatic meditation when the nuns would feel one with Jesus' love and the Buddhists were one with the universe. And I called him because I saw his research. I read his research and I was like, dude, what we're seeing with the surfers in this state that I think we're calling flow, is that the same thing that's going on? And he, to his amazing credit, said, well, I don't know, but it sure sounds similar. So let's find out together. And that was my sort of gateway. It wasn't just that I was curious about this and I was working on this stuff. It was that one of the best neuroscientists in the world said, I don't know, but that's a good question. And I'll help you figure it out. And so that was sort of how all this started. But it was really, in the beginning, it was really complicated to try to, are we looking at mystical experiences? Are we looking at biological experiences? Are they psychological? What's going on? All these stuff were questions that have been answered over the past 30 years. But 30 years ago when I got started, we didn't have a clue. As scientists, we spent the 90s, the whole community of people, we had to prove that spiritual experiences were good for people before anybody would take this seriously. So there's all these studies that go back to the 90s that discovered religious affiliation produces health and longevity. And, now we know why and where that comes from and everything else. But literally, there's tons of studies where you had to, in the 90s, before anybody science would take it seriously, had to prove that spirituality, mysticism, and even flow was good for people before anybody would even take it seriously. So it's been a long, slow kind of process.
But I think what is so great, though, yes, but your process to it and the way you've done your research legitimizes it. And I think that's where you get this buy-in. I think human curiosity, people start looking for it.
Yeah. It was also really important to me. You can't do peak performance without flow. You cannot So if you're at the top of your field, I don't care what your field is. If you're top 30%, for example, you're doing this stuff. I've spent my career around the quote unquote, the most exceptional and extraordinary people who've done the impossible, right? That was my focus as a journalist, is those moments in time when impossible became possible. How did it happen? Flow was always part of the equation. So I've met all these people who have done the extraordinary. None of them, not any of them, started out extraordinary. Started out like you and me. They're average people. What they figured out is how their biology worked, and they did it over and over and over and over again. And I will, across the boards, this is true with everybody I've met. And I say that I went out of my way for 3.5 decades to meet the most extraordinary people on the planet. It was my job. And so I did it for a living for a really long time. Who are you? What did you do? How did you do it? I started to realize, I was like, well, wait a minute. These people are just like us. So I want flow. I want to bring it into the mainstream. I want everybody to have access to this, because a world where we're all performing at our best. The other side of this is, when we're in flow, the state automatically expands empathy and environmental awareness. We could talk about why that happens if you want. But So do I really care if insurance broker number 99 or salesman or saleswoman number 237 is really better at their job? Not a ton. But do I really think the world is a better place if they're more empathetic and wise and environmentally aware? Yes. So my trade is everybody wants flow. You can have it. I want a more empathetic, environmentally aware, wise world. And so to me, my desire to bring it to the mainstream is not about performance. It was more about, but the mainstream also, I'm interested in what people can do, right? These are just ordinary people who did extraordinary things in their life over and over and over because they understood how flow worked and how to get into this state and how to utilize the properties and some of the other components of peak performance. So I'm always interested in that. When I meet people, I'm always like, okay, what's possible in your life? What might you be able to do? So flow makes us 500% more productive. It doubles learning rates. So soldiers in flow, this is studies done by the U.S. Department of Defense, learn 240 to 500% faster than normal. Creativity, we did some of this work. They did some at Harvard, some at the University of Sydney. spikes 400 to 700%, depending on how you're measuring it. So you got to stop and ask yourself, like, what kind of impossible challenges aren't you going after? What would you go after if you could be 500% more productive, if you could cut learning times in half, or 600% more creative and innovative? Those are huge numbers. I think those are real questions. Those are scientifically accurate questions. Like that's what the science of peak performance is possible for all of us. So those are the questions that you have to sort of start to ask yourself. And I'm thrilled to me, it's really exciting and fun. And when I said I wanted to smuggle this stuff into the mainstream, I want empathy, I want environmental awareness, I want wisdom, but I also want to see what everybody can do with this stuff. I'm really tired of meeting people who are dead before they're dead. It really bugs me. I always tell people, like, look, aging is sort of a fact of life. Old is a mindset. And for biological reasons, that mindset sets up in our 20s. And it has a massive impact on performance, on our ability to access flow, on all this stuff. And so anything that I can do to explode those ideas and make people understand how much more they're actually capable of, to me, that's good. That's fun. I like that.
Yeah. Do you mind? I want to give you my dad's phone number. Would you give him a call and talk to him about this? Age as a mindset. Guess what he's getting for Christmas? Your book.
Good. Good.
I just want to comment on one thing. And there is something I think that is so human to what you just said, because I heard in the beginning some of your journey of how and why and this and that, but it's such an incredibly lovely side to you. Yes, you do want to see what people are capable of, but I want to see more empathy and environmental awareness. To me, and I think to a lot of us, that's your why. And that's lovely.
Well, animals have always been my why. But my wife and I run a dog sanctuary, do hospice care for dogs, and have for 20 years.
But you obviously care about humans too.
I'm pretty introverted, and I'm like,
Dude, you make a living off trying to make people better.
Yeah, I do, and I know, and I do. I don't like people as much as people think. All right. I don't. I like animals much more than I like people. I'm really open about that. I find it very difficult to convince people that like ecosystems are more important than their needs, which is a lot of the job. But if I can get you into flow, the stage sort of starts to do that automatically. That's easier. The sales job around environmental awareness is too hard. It's too big of a lift. I've been trying for 40 years. You should end up shouting at the rain. So I'm sneaky. This is the back door.
But that's great. By making people better, you get your end goal.
By making people better, they become better, right? Like,
yes.
Cool. You want peak performance? That's cool. I want to see what you do with the peak performance, because if I'm just training you up in flows, you can like sell more widgets in your, widget sale. Like, okay, really? I mean, like, I'm interested in like, no, blow my frickin' mind. When I start, this is the other thing that's really important here, Stephanie. So when I started out my career, I was interested in neuroscience, I was interested in peak performance. I started in action sports, right? And I was living in these communities. This was during the 90s. The 90s in action sports and surfing, skiing, rock climbing, snowboarding, all of it, it's talked about as like the era of impossible. More impossible feats got accomplished, stuff that had never been done before. We didn't think it was ever going to be done than ever before. But I was in these communities. I was seeing it firsthand. Talking to them, flow was always in the mix of like how they did it, right? But it was these people. So if you know anything at all about peak performance or how do you raise a good kid, right? Forget how do you, right? What matters? Well, mom matters, nature, good environment, the right schools, the right, all that stuff matters. And yet everybody I knew, these action sport athletes like that in the communities I was in, they came from broken homes, they had bad childhoods. They had very little money, they had very little education. There was a lot of risk taking in these communities. There's a bunch of substance abuse. And normally you put those things together in a community, people die young or go to jail. They do not reinvent what's possible for the human species. And that's what I was seeing up front and in person all the time. So when I say that anybody can use flow to do the extraordinary, I'm not like I'm talking about like people who started so far. You know what I mean? People, you hear a lot about people talking about how people started second base or third base. These people were starting so far beyond before home plate. It was a miracle that they even got an at bat. And yet it was these people who reinvented what was possible for our species. And that was what really caught me. In fact, actually, what I've discovered over time is, you know who has a really tough time with peak performance? It's not people who are really, really poor, people who don't have a lot of education, or people who, all that stuff. It's folks who had a really easy time in high school. if you were really popular, if you were naturally smart or naturally athletic and naturally really pretty, and high school was really easy for you, and you didn't actually have to learn how to be gritty and like how to regulate your emotions and do all that stuff, those are the people that are very hard to train in peak performance, actually. It turns out that the more you got your ass kicked earlier on, it works for you later in life a lot.
Okay, now I'm going to have you talk to my high school senior. We literally were just having the conversation yesterday that, don't worry, high school sucks. It sucks for most people. It's okay. It gets better than this. Life gets better.
One other thing I wanted to tell you, since you have a high school senior, because this is something nobody tells kids and nobody tells anybody, it's so important. So, geeky flow detail. Flow states have cycles. They're not a binary. It's not in the zone, out of the zone. It's a 4-stage cycle. And you got to move all the way through all 4 stages to get back into flow. You can't live in a flow state. There's no permanent, always on flow state because of the cycle. The front end of a flow state is called struggle. It is a loading phase. You are learning, you are loading and overloading the brain with information. And here's a couple things that we don't tell our children that are really important. One, when you're in this struggle phase and this loading phase, frustration is literally built into how it works. You will get frustrated by design. We have working memory. It holds about 4 concepts at once. To struggle properly, you have to overload it. You're literally going to be frustrated. And most people and most kids are taught that frustration is a sign that you're doing something wrong. Stop. This is failure. And in peak performance, it's actually a sign that you're moving in the right direction. You're exactly where you need to be. Doesn't feel any better, but literally this is how it's supposed to feel. And we don't teach that to kids. And so they get these bad feelings and they think they're doing something wrong. And being kids, they're self-conscious. It does all that other stuff, right? So you end up with this spiral off of this negative feeling. And that negative feeling is actually a positive feeling. It's a sign that you're moving in the right direction because it helps us reframe frustration. And it turns out the more we struggle, the more frustrated we are, the better chance we actually have of solving the problem in the end and learning the thing we're trying to learn. So the more frustrated, the better. What I like to tell people is like, take it to the point that your head's about to explode and then walk away. And just know that feeling of my head's going to explode, I feel like a failure. And it's actually a sign that you're doing exactly what you want to do.
Okay, so I want to talk about your next book coming out. This new book is not because of your aging, even though it's a book on aging per se. 2 things. One, people absolutely have a fear of getting older. And secondly, they absolutely have a fear of dying. And I think that's why in our society, there's this culture, I would even go to the point of saying an obsession with trying to stay young, mentally, physically, spiritually, everything. Why do you think we have such a fear? And how much of that do you think influenced or impacted the idea of taking everything that you know and putting it specifically towards
this challenge?
Yeah.
So back in the 90s, Ernest Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for a book called The Denial of Death. That was literally about how we are so death phobic, right? That like most everything that you can think of, our cultures, our societies, our religions, take your pick, they're all reactions against this fear. It definitely seems to be very hardwired. It has a huge impact on our psychology. And if you're interested in training things like peak performance, you have to sort of acknowledge it and work with that. That's part of getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. You can't pretend it's not there. So that's part of it. I, by the way, use a Tibetan death practice. So every day when I hike my dogs, there's a standard Tibetan death practice, which is a 3-line mantra, which is everything is impermanent. Death comes without a warning. This body too will be a corpse someday. And I repeat it to myself for at least 5 to 10 minutes every time I'm hiking my dogs.
That's really positive.
So recognizing that change is foundational to life is part of what you do to maintain a healthy mindset towards aging. It's one of the ways to train mindset is to notice, because the brain tends to trick us into believing that stasis is that we think we're the same person that we were 10 years ago, 20, and we're not at all. But it's this illusion of self and things like that. So the brain notices and tries to protect the stability, and we don't see, right? So one, noticing that everything has changed, this actually like lessens our fear of aging. It's one of the things that does that. So it's really useful. And the other thing is it's a really solid reminder to sort of live every day as if it was your last, because it very much could be. And I think those are important things. And I do them because I'm like everybody else. I'm scared of them. You know what I mean? I've got the same fears as everybody else. So like, I'm just trying to work with it. But the second half of your question, which is the real reason I wrote In Our Country, the old idea about aging is what I like to call the long, slow rot theory. And it's the dominant theory of aging that most of us are familiar with, is the idea that most our mental skills, our physical skills, they decline over time, and there's nothing we can do to stop the slide. And I mean, then they start declining early in our 20s and our 30s in some cases, right? And this was the dominant theory of aging, and it turns out none of it's true. Well, actually, a little bit of it's true. It turns out that all the skills we used to think decline over time, what we now know, and this is overwhelming, is that they're all use it or lose it skills. So if you never stop training these skills, you can hang on to them and even advance them far later in life than anybody thought possible. Now, I should also say that, like, of the skills, why am I in this work? Where did it come from? Flow science is deeply baked into adult development, peak performance aging, all this stuff. It's a big part of it. And one thing to know is that flow is foundational for peak performance. It becomes even more important for peak performance aging. But like everything else, our ability to get into flow diminishes over time for a bunch of reasons. We can talk about why. You have to counteract that with training. And so that's kind of, at the center of what the book is. The other thing that the book is it's really about applied flow science. So like, it's really easy to teach people about the biology, the cognitive literacy, but the day-to-day application, how do you do it on a day-to-day basis first of all, it's individual. And second of all, it changes on a day-to-day basis. And In Our Country is a diary right through this like hard physical challenge that I take on. And the reason it's done that way is because it's a recipe book in a sense. It's not written that way, but like, if, it's Tuesday, I have to go to work, don't feel great, I didn't get a ton of sleep, and I'm feeling a little bit of anxiety. I also know I need to, like, I've got a presentation. If I don't hit it out of the park, this whole project is going sideways. It'd be really great if I could drop into flow in this high challenge situation. So how do you do that? What's the recipe for flow when you're starting there? And that's what this book also allowed me to do, is sort of break down on a day-by-day basis, this is how you go after the state. This is how you use the triggers. This is how you sort of deal with wherever you are at the time.
Super fascinating. Okay. Do you plan to retire?
No. So Daniel Levitin, who's a neuroscientist at McGill, at the same time as I was writing In Our Country, wrote a book called Successful Aging, where I ran a bunch of studies and did a whole bunch of other stuff, but we read the same like 5,000 papers. They're on the papers that basically show, because the long, slow rot theory, the fact that all our skills decline, it really starts with Freud in 1907. Freud makes a comment and it's like off to the races. And between 1907 and like 1995, all we do is prove Freud right. We just get so nitpicky about what declines and when it declines. And by like 1995, we're just screwed. I mean, like, we're just a really bleak story. And then bits of data start showing up. And by now it's that whole idea has exploded, but it didn't, it was sort of one at a time, a little bit in a row that we started to figure out, oh, wait a minute. It's not that these things decline over time. They're all trainable. How do we train various things has been a puzzle that people have tried to figure out, because some of it is less than obvious. What I think is telling and interesting, and where I think I want to go with this, is if you think about aging, most people think that's a problem for later, not now. And what the research shows is that peak performance aging starts young. So there's stuff you want to do in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, right? Like every decade, there's really boxes to check that are really important. And the second thing is most of what we hear, right? Let's say you don't believe the long, slow rot theory and you think there are possibilities. What you're tapped into is like longevity science, regenerative medicine, biohacking. All those things they may be real, they may be fake, but they're very much cutting edge. And it's going to be 20, 25 years before we actually know. So regenerative medicine, longevity science is the second generation, basically. And all the stuff gets started in the around 2000s, first generation. there's like 10% of that's left that we were like, oh yeah, those were good ideas. The other 90% has been thrown out, right? So the other side of this is the big levers, what like mindset. There's these psychological interventions in a sense that really matter. And so on the other side of the longs that are up there is the stuff, most of the stuff that people are doing is the wrong stuff. They're reaching for these like biohacks because they think those are the tools. And yet we've got 50 years of science that say, oh no, maintaining robust social connections really matters far more. Exercise. The number one coordinate for health and longevity is strong legs, believe it or not, for preserving cognitive function, physical function, everything. Thigh muscle mass inversely correlates with mortality.
Gonna live to 120, I think. This is great.
Nice.
Thank you.
Good job. I'm going to leave you with one wild fact. You'll like this. So how do you stave off cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, and dementia? We know lifelong learning. Why is that? It's expertise and wisdom. This is one of the reasons flow matters so much over time is flow, as we know, automatically expands wisdom. So why does that matter? Think of the difference between expertise is about like facts and strategies and tactics and systems, right? That's expertise. Wisdom is emotional intelligence writ large. It's some other things, but that's sort of what it is. And they're separate categories in the brain. But what's cool is that most cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's is in the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain behind your forehead. From an evolutionary perspective, it's the most recent part of your brain, so it's the most vulnerable to disruption. Expertise and wisdom form these wildly diffuse and redundant, key here is redundant, networks across the prefrontal cortex. And so the brain never learns one way to do anything, whether it's an emotional problem, wisdom, or a physical problem, expertise. It wants like 11 different ways to do the thing, right? And so redundancy is baked into everything the brain does. And so what happens is expertise and the wisdom we get in flow on top of, and the expertise we get in flow, they not only give us better performance, they make us wiser over time. That wisdom is actually neuroprotective against cognitive decline. Why? Because what good would wisdom be if we can't pass it along to our grandchildren? So when you get wiser, you live longer because evolution wants you to be able to pass it along. In fact, the craziest stat in peak performance aging is off of this, which is grandparents who hang out with their grandkids and pass along knowledge. When their grandkids get to childbearing years, they will be more fecund. It's one of the reasons we started to realize, it was just one of the things about humans, that we violate the standard. Most species, they reproduce and they die. Humans don't. So why is that? Why, right? And why do we live multi-generations? And it's this reason. So the more contact between grandparent and grandchildren, they're more likely to have that you're going to end up with many grandchildren. It's crazy, right?
It is crazy. Super sincere. Thank you for your time today. This has been hopefully kind of fun.
This was fun.
Super insightful.
Thank you. If they're interested in more, StephenKotler.com is me. Flow Research Collective, getmoreflow.com, and narcountry.com is the website for the book.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.